Okay, so hello again, everyone. I'm Mike Mena. Today we're looking at part 3 of History of Sexuality. It's entitled Scientia Sexualis. I'd like to start with a quote from page 56, kind of towards the bottom. Okay, so it reads, "The essential point is that sex was not only a matter of sensation and pleasure, of law and taboo, but also of truth and falsehood, that the truth of sex became something fundamental, useful, or dangerous, precious, or formidable. In short, that sex was constituted as a problem of truth." So what does that mean, to discover the truth of sex? What are the falsehoods of sex? In other words, what can we describe as fact? It should be no surprise, then, that there emerged all these forms of sciences on the topic of sex. As even today, science is in charge of producing fact and truth, seemingly immune from political and historical conditions, almost a historical platform of knowledge production. We can make up all these incredible vocabularies and specialized knowledges that few can actually dispute. For example, they might not have any credentials to dispute it with. And so Foucault is always suspicious of anything that claims to be a science. Immediately, we can ask, science in the service of what? Or whom? And why call yourself a science? It is exactly because there is an assumption that the kind of knowledge you're producing as a science is of the highest order of fact. And in many cases, only different sciences are allowed to critique scientific knowledge. So there's a power in calling yourself and calling your knowledge and what you produce science. It is precisely this that Foucault works against. In fact, he calls his genealogical method the anti-science. Not, and that's a quote, anti-science. So it's not anti-intellectual, but anti-scientism, or anti-scientific institutions that claim to know ultimate truths, to know positivistic facts. So, in this chapter, Foucault lays out the conditions which set the stage for medicine and science to come in and kind of take over all the talk about sex. Or at least science created this new arena of discursive production. He begins by talking about an Eastern ars erotica, which focused on pleasure and the body itself. This is a different kind of knowledge production. In the West, we had what he calls a Scientia Sexualis, which is based on truthness and falseness. Now, these are fundamentally different ways to produce discourses, to produce knowledge. These are two kinds of sexuality. The point being, we do sexuality in this particular way in the West, and if we produce this way of doing things, then we can also produce something different. And just a side note about this Eastern ars erotica thing, Foucault later said in an interview somewhere, I'm not sure where, that he regretted using the East as this contrasting example, because this, of course, feeds into colonial exoticizing discourses that have come to define what the East is. So just a side note there. Okay, so Foucault begins by providing an overview of the confessional, saying that the Western man has become a confessing animal. That's page 59. So think of all the confession-like discourses we have, from child to parent, police interrogations, admitting embarrassing details to your doctors or teachers, confessing you did something wrong or forgot your homework. In some cases, we don't even need another person to confess to. We might pray to a deity and confess this or that. And then in other cases, we don't even really need anything external to us, like when we admit to ourselves something that we might be hiding from ourselves, such as liking a particular sexual practice but not wanting to admit it to yourself, right? So we're given so many opportunities to confess that it almost seems natural. And these mechanisms of repeated confession produces a particular type of subjectivity, or perhaps a Western subjectivity. And remember, within all of these confessionals, there is a speaker and there's a listener. And there's a power dynamic, a power relationship between the two. So Foucault says that we got very used to talking and confessing. Science, in fact, used this developing subjectivity to collect and produce knowledge through scientific discursivity, which is a word that Foucault uses. Discursivity is just a fancy way of saying discourse put into practice, something like that. So remember, discourse, which I've been calling conversations every now and then, does not necessarily need to be spoken. All the paperwork that comes out of, let's say, your doctor's office, that is medical discourse. Additionally, discourse doesn't even absolutely need to be language, per se. For example, think of the X-rays in your files, which are iconic representations of your body. So discourse can be expanded into all these semiotic realms. But if that blows your mind, just come back to the idea of a multi-person, multi-institutional conversation and what can be included in this conversation. The last part of this video, I want to go over the 5 bulleted points that Foucault says characterize the way we transformed confession into medical and scientific discourse. So, the first one was through the clinical codification of the inducement to speak, which is what is in italics, right? So here doctors began pairing what patients said with symptoms, and then began kind of translating this, translating what they said into a medical jargon as part of what was wrong or as part of their symptoms, for example. The second one, through the postulate of a general and diffuse causality. So this describes the way doctors searched for causes of any and every sexual difficulty, which was often linked to other sexual difficulties. So if you think of Freud, he might trace something that's wrong as being caused by your attraction to your mother or father or something. The third one is the principle of latency. So latency, you can think of this as something being present but not visible. Now the word latency is used by Freud a lot to describe underlying causes of symptoms X, Y, and Z. In his work on dreams, he always says there's latent content, which is what's driving the manifest content, which is the stuff we actually see in our dreams. So the idea is that there is something there, that needs to be explained about sex, that people hide from themselves. Okay, so, and the fourth one, here the confession has a brand new use. It's not only to unburden oneself or to test our faith, it becomes a sign of continuity. And it becomes possible to trace back and interpret all of these latent mechanisms hidden from the person. This inevitably produces the psychoanalyst, who becomes the trained, qualified personnel that has the right to do this. And finally, the effects of confession, number 5, the medicalization of the effects of confession. So we begin believing confession, or putting our feelings into words, has curing effects, that the act of speaking itself becomes therapeutic. It becomes part of what cures us. Okay, so that is all that I got for this part. I will see you in the next part.